I took the job as a caretaker for the old Lighthouse, thinking it would be the perfect way to hit reset. Life in the city had been crushing me. Too much noise, too many people, and way too many bad decisions piling up like trash on a street corner. The idea of isolation sounded ideal. No emails, no calls, no pressure to be anyone other than some guy keeping a piece of history intact. The job sounded simple enough. Keep the lighthouse clean, monitor the property, and make sure the place didn't completely fall apart under the salty sea air. It was just me, a boatload of supplies, and the promise of time to think. But I swear, the moment I saw the lighthouse, something felt off. The building stood tall against a backdrop of an endless, gray sky. Its white and red paint was chipped and weathered, like it had been beaten down by centuries of storms. The steps creaked underfoot like the groans of something alive, and the inside smelled of damp stone and mildew. The island itself was just as grim, a jagged ring of cliffs surrounding a patch of rocky, uneven ground dotted with patches of dying grass. Getting there wasn't easy, either. The barge ride was long and rough, with the waves slamming against the hull like fists. As the barge captain dropped me off, he handed me a lantern and muttered something that still rings in my ears. Doesn't matter what you hear or see. Never light the lamp after midnight. It sounded ridiculous at the time, like something out of a ghost story. I laughed nervously, but his face stayed stone cold. It wasn't until later that I realized how serious he was. The first night was harder than I expected. The silence was deafening, like the whole world had been muted. I sat in the small kitchen with the lantern the captain gave me, its weak flame flickering against the cracked walls. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows so hard I thought they might shatter. I told myself it was just the wind when I started hearing strange noises, soft, almost musical murmurs that seemed to drift in from the sea. At first I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, maybe an echo of the waves, but the sound had a rhythm, almost like voices. I went to the window, peered out, and saw nothing but darkness and the faint glint of the moon on the water. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the edge of the light. By the second day, I was already regretting taking the job. The isolation that had sounded so appealing felt like a weight pressing on my chest. Exploring the lighthouse didn't help much either. The place was a mess, rusted pipes, water-stained walls, and a spiral staircase so steep and narrow it made my head spin. I found an old logbook in one of the drawers, probably left behind by a previous keeper. Most of it was mundane dates, weather conditions, and notes about minor repairs, but a few entries stood out. One in particular sent a chill down my spine. It simply read, "They come for the light." I had no idea what it meant, but something about those words felt wrong. I put the book away and tried to laugh it off. But that night, the whispers came back, louder this time, like they were coming from just outside the door. By the third night, sleep was impossible. The whispers hadn't stopped since sundown, and they were growing clearer. It was no longer just faint murmurs. I could make out fragments of words, though not in any language I recognized. It sounded like a chorus, rising and falling in an unnatural harmony. I tried to drown it out with an old radio I found in the keeper's quarters, but all I got was static. The longer I listened, the more the static seemed to blend with the voices outside, until I couldn't tell the two apart. I decided to head up to the lantern room to distract myself. The climb was exhausting, each creaking step making me feel more like I was being pulled towards something I shouldn't see. The view from the top was incredible, though a panoramic sweep of the sea, endless and dark. But then, far out in the water, I saw them, shadows. At first, I thought it was just the waves reflecting the moonlight, but these shapes didn't move like waves. They were tall, thin, and bobbed unnaturally against the current. I watched them for what felt like hours, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the light, but they started moving toward the island, slowly but deliberately. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. I stumbled down the stairs, nearly falling in my rush to get away from whatever was out there. Back in the kitchen, I sat with my back against the door, gripping the lantern so tightly my knuckles ached. The whispers had stopped, replaced by something worse, silence. It was so quiet I could hear my own breathing, and every tiny sound felt like a scream in the dark. The next evening, I couldn't bring myself to leave the small living quarters. I spent the whole day pacing, checking the locks on the doors and keeping the curtains drawn tight. The logbook kept pulling my attention like it was calling to me, daring me to read more. Against my better judgment, I flipped to the last few pages. The handwriting became erratic, almost illegible, and the entries stopped making sense. Phrases like "the sea is alive" and "the light calls them home" were scrawled over and over. The final line was written so heavily the pen had torn through the page. "Never let the light die." My stomach churned as I read it. It felt like the words were alive, seeping into my brain, planting roots of fear I couldn't shake. That night, a storm rolled in, and with it came the pounding at the door. It started faintly, just a gentle knock that could have been mistaken for the wind. But it grew louder, more insistent. The sound echoed through the lighthouse, sharp and frantic, like someone, or something, was desperate to get inside. Then I heard a voice, clear as day. It called my name. At first, I froze, convinced I was losing my mind. But then the voice called again, this time sounding exactly like a friend I hadn't seen in years. The panic in his tone was unmistakable, and I found myself reaching for the door handle before I remembered the captain's warning. Never light the lamp after midnight. My hand stopped midair, trembling. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was on the other side wasn't human. The power went out shortly after midnight. The lighthouse plunged into total darkness, except for the faint glow of my lantern. The pounding at the door grew louder, more frenzied, accompanied by that voice, my friend's voice, pleading for me to let him in. It was impossible. He couldn't be here. No one could. But the desperation in his tone made me question everything. Maybe he'd found a way. Maybe he was in danger. But as I stood there, paralyzed with indecision, another sound joined the chaos. A low, guttural moan that seemed to rise from the ocean itself. It was deep, resonant, and filled the air like a warning bell. Whatever was out there was not just knocking, it was waiting. In a moment of panic, I bolted up the stairs to the lantern room. The thought of lighting the lamp terrified me, but sitting in the dark while those sounds pressed closer was worse. The rain lashed against the glass, the wind howling like a living thing. My fingers fumbled with the controls, slippery with sweat, and before I could think too much, I turned the light on. The beam cut through the storm, sweeping across the churning sea and illuminating the jagged rocks below. For a moment, I felt relief until the light caught something moving. Shapes, dozens of them, climbing the cliffs toward the lighthouse. My stomach dropped as I realized these weren't just shadows. They were figures, humanoid but wrong, bent at unnatural angles with glistening, scaly skin that reflected the light like oil on water. As the beam rotated, the creatures seemed to freeze whenever it passed over them, like the light paralyzed them momentarily. But as soon as it moved on, they resumed their climb, relentless and unshaken by the jagged rocks tearing at their bodies. My heart raced as I realized the light wasn't keeping them away. It was only slowing them down. One of the figures reached the edge of the cliff, dragging itself onto the wet grass with a grotesque, jerking motion. I could see it more clearly now, and the sight made my stomach turn. Its face was disturbingly human, but stretched and distorted, as though someone had molded it from clay and let it melt in the sun. Its eyes caught the beam of the light and gleamed like polished silver, unblinking and empty. I stumbled back from the window, nearly tripping over my own feet. My instinct screamed at me to run, but where? The creatures were closing in, and the pounding at the door below hadn't stopped. The voices outside were louder now, mingling with the guttural moans, forming a chilling cacophony that made my chest tighten. I grabbed the old logbook as if it held some kind of answer and flipped frantically through its pages. My hands trembled as I reached the last entry again. The light not only calls them, it lets them in. My breath caught in my throat. Turning off the light seemed like suicide, but keeping it on felt just as deadly. The air inside the lighthouse grew heavy, oppressive, as if something unseen was watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. My mind was racing, but I couldn't think clearly. The creatures were almost at the base of the lighthouse now, their twisted forms silhouetted against the beam as it swung past them. The pounding on the door downstairs suddenly stopped, leaving an eerie, oppressive silence in its wake. That should have been a relief, but it wasn't. Somehow, the silence was worse. It felt deliberate, like the calm before a storm. I gripped the lantern tighter, the weak glow doing little to cut through the darkness around me. I forced myself to look out the window again, and that's when I saw one of them climbing the side of the lighthouse. Its long, clawed hands scraped against the brick as it pulled itself up with unnatural speed. It didn't need the door. None of them did. I backed away from the window, heart pounding so hard it hurt. My only thought was to hide. But where? The living quarters felt too exposed, and the lantern room offered no escape. The sound of nails dragging against the outside walls grew louder, accompanied by a sickening, wet slapping noise as more of them began to scale the lighthouse. I could hear the wind screaming through cracks in the old stone, but beneath it was something else. Whispers, faint but unmistakable. They were everywhere now, surrounding me, filling my ears with words I couldn't understand, but somehow felt were meant for me. My legs gave out, and I sank to the floor, clutching the lantern like a lifeline. I squeezed my eyes shut, but even then, I could feel them getting closer. I don't know what possessed me, but in my panic, I snuffed out the lantern. The darkness that followed was suffocating, pressing in from all sides like a living thing. The whispers stopped almost immediately, replaced by a heavy silence that seemed to amplify every shallow breath I took. My body trembled, and I held my knees to my chest, trying to stay as small and quiet as possible. Outside, the scraping on the walls ceased, and for a brief moment, I dared to hope that they couldn't sense me without the light. But then came the sound, a slow, deliberate tapping on the glass of the window just above me. I didn't want to look, but my body betrayed me. My head tilted upward, and there it was. Its face was pressed against the glass, inches away from mine. The contours of its features were disturbingly familiar, like staring into a funhouse mirror version of myself. Its mouth twisted into a grotesque mimicry of a smile, revealing jagged, uneven teeth. Its eyes, those empty, reflective orbs, locked onto mine, and I felt an icy dread wash over me. It didn't move. It just stared unblinking, as if studying me. My heart thundered in my chest, and I bit down on my lip to keep from screaming. Then, with a sound like nails on a chalkboard, it dragged one of its claws across the glass, a slow, deliberate motion that felt like a warning. I didn't know what to do. There was no escaping this. All I could do was pray it wouldn't find a way in. The thing at the window eventually disappeared, melting back into the shadows like it had never been there. I stayed frozen in place, my muscles locked with fear, listening to every creak and groan of the lighthouse. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating, until I began to wonder if it was finally over. Slowly, I crawled toward the window, careful to stay low and out of sight. Peeking through the edge of the glass, I saw nothing but darkness and the faint outlines of the cliffs below. My breath caught in my throat. Had they gone? The thought barely had time to form when I heard it, a loud, deliberate thump on the floor above me. My stomach turned to ice. The lantern room. They were inside. Somehow, they'd found a way past the walls, past the locked doors. I forced myself to my feet, every instinct screaming at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The stairwell leading down felt like a trap, and going up was unthinkable. My mind raced for answers, but I was out of options. Then, as if in response to my spiraling panic, the beam of the lighthouse abruptly stopped spinning. The light flickered once, twice, and then died, plunging the island into total darkness. That's when I understood. I had broken the rule, and now, the lighthouse was no longer mine to command. The moment the light went out, the whispers returned, louder and more chaotic than ever. They seemed to come from every direction, weaving through the walls and into my skull. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. My legs buckled, and I fell to the floor, the cold stone biting into my skin. The The sound was unbearable, like 1,000 voices speaking in languages I couldn't understand, but somehow felt were meant to consume me. I could hear movement now, the scrape of claws against stone and the heavy thud of footsteps descending from the lantern room. They were inside, and they were coming for me. In a blind panic, I scrambled to my feet and stumbled toward the stairwell leading to the ground floor. My only thought was to get to the boat. I didn't care if I had to swim through the freezing water. I just needed to get off that cursed island. But as I reached the bottom of the stairs, I stopped cold. The door to the outside was wide open, the storm raging just beyond the threshold. In the doorway stood one of the creatures, its hunched silhouette outlined by the occasional flash of lightning. It turned its head slowly toward me, and for the first time, I heard its voice. It wasn't a growl or a screech it spoke. The sound was low and gravelly, like rocks grinding together, but the words were unmistakable. "You called us," it said. My blood ran cold. I hadn't spoken a word since the light went out, but I understood what it meant. Turning on the lamp, breaking the rule, that was the call. I backed away slowly, my legs trembling so badly I could barely stand. The creature tilted its head, watching me with those reflective eyes, and then it stepped forward, crossing the threshold into the lighthouse. I bolted back up the stairs, adrenaline propelling me despite the burning in my legs. The whispers grew louder with every step, as if the walls themselves were alive and taunting me. I slammed the door to the lantern room shut behind me and threw my weight against it, but I knew it wouldn't hold. The wood was old, damp, and weak. I looked around, desperate for anything I could use to block the door, but the room was bare except for the light mechanism and a few rusty tools. My eyes darted to the windows, but the storm outside made it impossible to see anything clearly. All I could do was wait and hope that the thing below wouldn't, or couldn't, come any closer. The door didn't hold for long. The wood splintered with a deafening crack, and the creature forced its way inside. Its movements were deliberate, almost lazy, like it knew I had nowhere to go. I backed away until I hit the edge of the room, my body pressed against the cold metal of the light mechanism. It stood there for a moment, staring at me, its twisted face illuminated by the occasional flash of lightning from the storm outside. The whispers seemed to echo from it, pouring into the room like a tide. My head throbbed as they grew louder, more insistent, drowning out my thoughts. Then, with an eerie calm, it raised one of its clawed hands and pointed at the light. I understood the message instantly. It wanted me to turn it back on. My hand instinctively reached for the lever, but I hesitated. Turning the light on was what had drawn them here in the first place. And yet, something told me this was a choice with no good outcome. The whispers grew sharper, more urgent, and the creature took a step closer. Its eyes bore into mine, filled with a malice so intense I thought my chest might cave in under its weight. The storm outside seemed to roar in unison, the wind battering the windows as if urging me to decide. My fingers trembled over the lever, sweat pouring down my face as the realization hit me. Whatever I chose, I wasn't walking out of this unscathed. I pulled the lever. The light sputtered back to life with a mechanical groan, sweeping across the storm-lashed sea. The creature didn't flinch as the beam passed over it, but something outside did. Through the cracked glass of the lantern room, I saw them again, the figures climbing the cliffs, but this time they weren't stopping. The light wasn't slowing them down anymore. If anything, it seemed to energize them, their twisted forms moving faster, more deliberately, as they swarmed toward the lighthouse. My heart sank. Turning the light on hadn't saved me. It had only sealed my fate. The creature in the room with me tilted its head, almost as if it were smiling. Then it stepped aside, clearing a path to the door. I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted past it, nearly slipping on the wet floor as I raced down the stairs. The whispers followed me, louder and more chaotic, echoing through the narrow stairwell like a storm of their own. By the time I reached the ground floor, the doorway was filled with more of them, their glistening forms dripping seawater onto the stone. I turned toward the back exit, praying it hadn't been blocked, and burst into the night. The rain hit me like icy needles, the wind so strong it nearly knocked me off my feet. The boat was still there, bobbing violently in the waves. It felt impossibly far, but it was my only hope. I ran toward the boat, slipping and stumbling on the slick, uneven ground. The creatures were everywhere now, emerging from the cliffs, the sea, and the shadows themselves. Their movements were jerky and unnatural, like marionettes with tangled strings, but they were fast, too fast. One of them lunged from the side, its claws swiping inches from my face. I veered toward the edge of the island, nearly losing my footing on the wet rocks, but I kept going. The boat was just ahead, thrashing into violent waves. I could make it. I had to make it. When I reached the dock, I jumped into the boat without thinking, almost capsizing it as the storm fought to pull it back to the sea. My hands fumbled with the oars, my arms burning as I tried to row against the current. The whispers were deafening now, rising into a frenzied chant that drowned out even the roar of the storm. I glanced back toward the lighthouse, and my blood ran cold. The creatures had stopped at the edge of the dock, watching me, their eyes glowing like fireflies in the dark. And then, one by one, they turned and began climbing the lighthouse, their forms disappearing into the beam of light that still swept across the water. The storm began to calm as I rowed further from the island, but the whispers lingered, faint now, like an echo in the back of my mind. I didn't look back again. I couldn't. The lighthouse stood like a beacon in the darkness, its light sweeping across the waves, steady and unyielding. But I knew what that light meant now. It wasn't a warning or a guide. It was a call, and I had answered it. My arms ached with every stroke, and the cold bit through my soaked clothes, but I kept rowing until the island was a faint shadow on the horizon. When the barge captain found me hours later, drifting aimlessly in the gray dawn, I didn't have the words to explain what had happened. I couldn't even meet his eyes. He just nodded, like he understood, and said nothing as he helped me aboard. As we pulled away, I caught one last glimpse of the lighthouse in the distance. The light was still spinning, brighter now against the morning sky. I thought it was over, until I saw the new entry in the logbook, scrawled in handwriting that wasn't mine. Never let the light go out at dawn.